Hello and welcome to this video on the Brothers Karamazov. We are going to be discussing the book, The Brothers Karamazov, and I am joined by Ekaterina and Matt. Before we get into talking about some of the interesting parts of the Brothers Karamazov, like interpreting Alyosha, Ivan, Dmitri, Karamazov, and discussing, of course, the most notable part of the books, the Grand Inquisitor and Rebellion, let's get started off with introducing ourselves. Matt, would you like to start off by talking a bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So I guess on the YouTube side of things, I've had a philosophy channel, 60-Second Philosophy, which, a bit of spoiler alert, is going through a little bit of a rebrand right now. So depending on when this comes out, it may or may not be 60-Second Philosophy. Been interested in philosophy for a while and really, really love Dostoevsky and his writing. So I'm excited to be talking about this one.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to hear some of your insights. Ekaterina, how about you?
Hi, I'm Ekaterina from a channel Katya Pavlov Art. My channel is dedicated to Slavic mythology and my original art projects. I also might have a book being published by the way this video will be published, but I'm not sure when it's going to be. But yeah, I grew up with Dostoevsky and I read him at school, and I am excited to talk about all those deep topics that was in the book.
Wonderful. I am looking forward to hear some of the insights that you have on this topic. And just a quick note about myself. I am Joshua Yen. I currently run the YouTube channel Philosophy for All. I try to provide accessible philosophical content to a wider audience, especially in relationship to the philosophy of religion and existentialism. So I really love the Brothers Karamazov and all the works of Dostoevsky. So I can't wait to get into talking about this book with you. So let's start off with thinking about some of the characters, because of course Dostoevsky's characters are often found at the heart of his novels, and a lot of his storylines and his arguments are fundamentally surrounded on the different proponents and ideas which are embodied by different characters. So we'll start off this discussion by talking about the three main characters, the three brothers, which make up the Brothers Karamazov, Alyosha, Ivan, and Dmitri. So let's start off with talking about Alyosha. What are some of the initial reactions or thoughts that you had when you first approached this book and came across the character of Alyosha?
I think one of the important things when you're thinking about the characters in lots of Russian novels is sort of their function in the overall point of the book, what Dostoevsky is trying to say. And you were mentioning that one of the cruxes of this book is sort of the problem of evil, and this conversation between Alyosha and his brother bring up a lot of the really serious questions about how God could sort of exist around these problems. And I think Alyosha sort of functions as the answer to the problem of evil in one sense, because while he doesn't really do anything particularly special, he's not a hero, he's not killing bad guys, he's not doing anything out of the ordinary. His very existence in each of these circumstances, with his brother, with his father, with the women, there's the little boy, all of these instances, his function is to sort of make the world a little bit better. Just his presence becomes an answer. He's sort of the role of the church, the role of Christ in the world. And I think that's one of the important things to really grasp as we move forward with these characters and with these big questions.
Yes, I really love your analysis and how you kind of tie it into the Brothers into the problem of evil, and one of those things which I think, from a structural point of view, when you're thinking about where the Brothers Karamazov is situated in the life of Dostoevsky's writings, it's one of his later works, and partially in some sense the Brothers Karamazov was the first part of a three-part series about the life of Alyosha, first growing up, going into the world, and developing as such. And the Brothers Karamazov is purely just the first part of his life. And we don't really have that many notes about what would go on in the future. But I definitely do think that how you tie him into the problem of evil and that existential response being embodied via act and not necessarily by philosophy is something which is a very important element of Dostoevsky's approach to the problem of evil and to the idea about theodicy. And we can touch upon that a bit later as well when we come back to talk about the problem of evil. But I would like to kind of tie in, or at least develop this discussion a bit more about Alyosha, because in the past we talked a bit about the idiot. I think Matt and Ekaterina were on the channel with me to talk about the idiot as well. Mm-hmm. And in the idiot, we came across a very peculiar character called Mushkin, and Mushkin was this very interesting character who seemed so happy, so pure, but at the same time seemed to be almost somewhat purely naive, in the sense that perhaps that is not exactly the paradigm of life. And if you have that conclusion in mind, or at least you have the backdrop of Mushkin, how would you say, I guess, does Alyosha develop from it? Because I guess he follows a very similar archetype of the Christian who loves the world, who loves everyone around him. How would you kind of compare those two characters together for perhaps reference? Ekaterina, would you like to start us off on that comparison?
Yeah, that is very that is very accurate comparison, because they are very pure, kind, good intended. I think regarding Mishkin, he's more acting independently, and that's why some things that happened to him didn't work out. But with Alyosha, he has a mentor. And he has a mentor and spiritual figure that he communicates with. And that's why his journey was more, stable, I would say. It really empowers him, Zosima. He really empowers Alyosha and just keeps, developing this good qualities, this goodness in Alyosha, and it does really separate him from Mishkin, because Mishkin is just surrounded and he's just in this environment, and he kind of... But in Alyosha's case, he has a mentor, and he kind of has more power because of it, and he's passively but impacts his environment. Do you remember, Mishkin, he was, kind of... everyone openly says you're an idiot, and, and with Alyosha, people in his community even, treat him differently. He's, everyone is happy to see him, and he just has this vibe, I guess.
Yes, that's a very, very brilliant analysis, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. Alyosha has a mentor, and in some sense Mushkin does not. And I think there's a few strands of this thought that we can develop further. But perhaps before we talk a bit about some of these ideas, Matt, what are some of your thoughts about this kind of comparison between the two archetypal characters?
I actually was not in that discussion, nor have I read the book, so I may not be useful for that comparison. But I think that there is something to say about... You mentioned Zosima. I think another really good comparison is actually Elder Zosima's brother, who we only meet for a little while. And the reason I bring him up is because there's actually... I know we're kind of making a big circle here, but there's actually a lot of similarity between the brother and Dostoevsky himself, which kind of helps us to understand the insights of the author, because... famously, Dostoevsky was sentenced to death, and he was going to be executed by Tsar Nicholas, and his death sentence was commuted. But after the sort of dust settled, we have some of his writings that indicate sort of how he responded to this new lot on this new lease on life. And the brother, as he's approaching death, we see a lot of the same verbiage used, talking about, how pure and how excellent life is. And we see that a little bit after Zosima's duel as well. And I think that ties into the whole Christian notion in sort of really important ways, because how do I say this? Well, maybe you could pick it up for me.
Yes, I think you definitely present a very interesting point, and apologies, I completely forgot that you weren't part of the discussion on idiot, but I definitely think you raise a very important point in relation to Zosima and Zosima's brother, and I think when you're thinking about Alyosha in relationship to Christianity, and this ties, I think, very nicely back to what Ekaterina was discussing about previously compared to Mushkin. There almost is this point, and now I was doing a bit of reading about Mushkin, and one of the interesting things that scholarship has noted, especially a writer called Susan McReynolds, she suggested that the difference between Mushkin and Alyosha, or at least she was talking about Mushkin, was that Mushkin seems throughout the book, although is a heart to positive energy and does embody that positively Christian idea, nevertheless seems to lack a fundamental essence of religion to him. He doesn't talk much about Christianity, or nevertheless acts it out in a sense, but never really attributes his actions to it in so much as, or in contrast to how Alyosha, you clearly look at him and you know, well, he is clearly part of the Orthodox Church. And that is a very interesting point, because if you compare Mushkin to Rousseau, you get this idea where although a positive action of good humanity can lead you so far and can lead to appreciation, it doesn't really get you the full picture to a full development of a mentally healthy person. It doesn't give you a full response to the problem of evil, as Matt was talking about previously. But rather, when you get Alyosha now as a development of Mushkin, if you buy into this kind of archetypal development, you then get a Christian thinker who acts positively, who loves the world, who loves other people, and can learn from that mentor. And I think one thing that we touch upon, now that you've raised Zosima, perhaps we should talk a bit about Zosima as well in relation to Alyosha, is that positive nature of the faith. And the reason why I call it the positive nature of the faith is that in Christianity, especially, well, Catholicism and Orthodoxy to some extent, there's a heavy emphasis on I suppose, exiting the world in the sense of, perhaps going to an abbey or going to a monastery, and you're in some sense set apart from the world. Whereas the message which comes from Zosima to Alyosha, and Alyosha seems to, at least there's that beautiful image in my mind of him at the child's funeral at the very end of the book, and they're like, hurrah to Karamazov, and one of the very interesting things is that Alyosha seems to be embodying that step into the world. So instead of trying to become a religious, perhaps recluse in some sense, by exiting the world into a monastery or into the life of a monastic kind of thinker, Alyosha, and in extension Zosima, is calling Alyosha to go out from the monastery, out of the world of protection, into the world to suffer, to struggle, to meet people and to learn from them, and to love the world through that and forgive people who hurt you. And I think that kind of, I suppose, develops upon the Mushkin-esque idea into perhaps a fuller understanding of the Christian calling, or at least what Dostoevsky viewed as a Christian calling. So perhaps with this in mind, or at least in response to that, Matt, do you have any thoughts to add on to that, or kind of any thoughts about Zosima, Alyosha, or entering into the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I could find the quote, it would be great. I'm looking here now, but a lot of the stuff that's revolving around Zosima and his brother are sort of like very how do we put this, not self-deprecating, but very humble, where he says, I've sinned against everybody. He's talking about sinning against the birds and the trees and everything like that. And I think one of the really interesting things, especially for like a modern reader, like a contemporary reader, is it just sounds so off, so weird. And I think it probably sounded weird to Dostoevsky's readers as well. But I think that like servant of all mentality is one of the really important elements of as you were mentioning, Alyosha's mentors. But then as it's sort of fed through him and put into practice in his interactions with the rest of the characters of the novel, something important to look out for. And I think one of the main points that Dostoevsky is making.
Mm-hmm. Zosima, he really put this base for Alyosha to develop his values, and that's why his character is spiritually more stronger than Myshkin, because he has a base, this spiritual base.
Yes, yeah. I think that's a very interesting thing you point out, and I suppose when we are thinking about when we're thinking about that spiritual base, it's very important that we are loving others, and I guess it goes back to the kind of the novelty of the Christian message about having to put the world first and loving those who hate us, and that's often a hard call, but it's something that I think Zosima presents very well. And I suppose before we move on to talk a bit more about Ivan Karamazov, who's absolutely a fascinating character, I would like to just read a small quote out of a description of the third son Alyosha in the Brothers Karamazov, because I think it's a very beautiful one. And it says, Alyosha was simply an early lover of mankind, and if he had struck out along the monastery road, it was only because it had at that time made a strong impression on him and presented itself to him as an ideal deliverance for his soul, straining as it was out of the murk of worldly hatred unto the light of love. I think that's a very beautiful quote about Alyosha and his motives, in some sense, about that focus on love and focus on the world, which is so key to Dostoevsky's philosophy and theology as well. Now, in contrast to that love and perhaps that murky world of hatred, perhaps, let's turn to Ivan Karamazov, perhaps the religious antagonist, or the atheistic antagonist, though of course there's a question of whether Ivan is atheistic himself, and we could touch upon that a bit in the future. But well, perhaps we could start off with a very broad question. How does one respond when reading Ivan Karamazov, and how does one find themselves in relation to the intellectual challenge that Ivan Karamazov faces? Because in some sense, some people often say that, well, and as we might discuss a bit later, that Ivan Karamazov provides the strongest argument against theism, which never really gets solved in the book. So perhaps what are some of the things which come to mind when you think about Ivan Karamazov?
I think one of the things, and you touched upon it briefly, is that Ivan is sort of the steelman case. So he makes some really good points when they're having that conversation in the cafe. But I think another part of that is that he's pretty much a likable character. You know, we can look at the father and not really like him. He's maybe one of the least likable characters in the whole book. But Ivan, he has good points. He has a likable approach. You're not led to dislike him, and I think that's part of the whole steelman thing. And one of the things that I maybe this is more of a question than anything is, I know with his mental decline and his physical decline, there was a lot of contemporary wisdom that if you had sort of mental distress, it could manifest itself physically. And I think that's sort of the point that Dostoevsky is making, that he himself is unsettled and he's having, these fevers and stuff like that. But I don't know if Dostoevsky is using that to indicate that he's just not in the right, if that's sort of the author's way of doing that, or if there's another point to that. I don't know if anyone has a thought on that.
Yes, I think it's a very brilliant analysis. And we could start off with talking about, well, it's definitely true that his complications are a result of his upbringing. And because some people would say Ivan's, at least perhaps some atheists would say, well, Ivan is such a good figure for relying on rationalism, or at least his reason, to try to solve all the problems, and his reason leads to the non-existence of God, and therefore all the other things follow from it. And some people might laud him or praise him for this heavy emphasis on reason. But at the same time, you could say, well, perhaps what was bad about Ivan was that he was actually unable to practice what he preached, and that perhaps could be something that Matt was touching upon previously. We could talk a bit about that. But perhaps what I'm trying to get at here is, what exactly do you think is that bad way that Ivan was dealing with the challenges and upbringing that he faced?
Well, they'd all definitely had a less than favorable upbringing. I mean, the first couple of chapters are just about, they're all getting thrown around to different relatives and different people. And then, of course, the father is a terrible guy to live with. So I think you're right about that.
Oh, yes. Yeah, basically because of their abusive father, I think he just has this not only like a spiritual conflict in terms of atheistic and versus Christianity conflict. He just has this like conflict on top of the conflict, that his upbringing was like his father figure is like abusive, and he wants to like emotionally to separate from that. You know what I mean?
Yes, definitely. And I would say you actually come closer to bad way as than you might think, because of course, although Dmitri gets charged with the murder, he's not actually the murderer. The murderer is actually Smerdyakov, and I think this ties in very beautifully to what Matt was presenting about the idea of like his dilemma and his struggle towards the end. And that's best, I suppose, emphasized by his dialogues with the demon or the devil, which was talking to him, which was fundamentally a result of his own subconscious, perhaps, and that's a possible way to read it. But there is this idea, I think, in with Ivan Karamazov, that he's fundamentally at war, not with other ideas beyond himself, but fundamentally at odds with himself, because, of course, Ivan is where you get that famous quote from. If there is no God, then all things are permissible. Though I think the proper translation of that quote is, if there is no immortality of the soul, then all things are permissible. The idea that it was if there is no God came in from Camus or Sartre, one of them. But nevertheless, I think that there is that idea that he has where he says, well, okay, God doesn't exist, or there is no immortality of the soul, there is no metaphysics. Then people can live as free as they want, and he professed that he couldn't accept that God existed, and we could talk whether he was an atheist a bit more about that later on in the video when we talk about the problem of evil. But there also is that idea that he fundamentally realizes that he's a very fundamentally moral person. So when he is raising the problem of evil, he is raising it not on the fact of a logical sense, but on the fact of a moral sense. And in that moral sense, he then fundamentally finds himself in contrast to his own very own proclamation that without God, all things are permissible, and that goes even further when Smerdyakov kills the father, and then goes and sees Ivan at the end, and then quotes back to Ivan his own philosophy or why he killed the father, because if there was no immortality of the soul, then everything is possible, or could be is permissible, and that, I think, is fundamentally, I think, the cause of his mental breakdown in some senses, because he very much realizes that man cannot live on the lack of an existence of God, but he cannot accept the existence of God, precisely because if God exists, there is morality, but on the grounds of morality, God, he cannot be accepted or worshipped. And I think that's a very fascinating look to Ivan, and perhaps that might be a certain reason for why he felt such a strong conflict within himself, or a contradiction between different ideas. Matt and Ekaterina, do you have any ideas or thoughts on that?
One quick little thing, and I'm not prepared to flesh this out, so just be warned. There's a lot of similarities between Ivan in Brothers K and Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. And so for people who are interested, that's a good thing to kind of track down. But both of them are basically, not exactly, but they're both intellectuals. They're both sort of operating under this philosophy, especially early on in Crime and Punishment, that sort of, I can do whatever I want, like this Ubermensch sort of philosophy. And it's interesting to see maybe just kind of another fractal of that philosophy being played out in the other book, Crime and Punishment.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting thing you note. Ekaterina, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's like very interesting comparison, especially because Ivan, he does change a little, like when Smerdyakov like kills their father, and he sees that like without this moral boundary, like something controlling, like there is a consequence, and like that it's, yeah, I think he kind of rethinks it now, but at the same time, I'm not exactly like blaming him, because it's complicated. I'm not exactly blaming him, because he just left and he knew what's going on, and he left and he didn't want to deal with it. But, he's not exactly responsible for it. But yeah, I think he's just kind of like realizing that like not anyone can do just what they want, because they need to be a boundary, a base, or something like that.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting point of view, and that idea, that connection between the two characters, Raskolnikov and Ivan Karamazov, is definitely a very good one. Now perhaps moving on from that, or at least developing on that, let's talk about the last brother, Dmitri, and what are our thoughts about him. Perhaps Matt, if you would like to start us off about your thoughts on Dmitri.
Sure. I think that Dmitri is sort of like the more accessible, less characterized version of the father. And also, as Dmitri likes to say, Alyosha has sort of this, I think the word is sensualist, this sensualist inside him as well. And so I think that we kind of use him as a touch point to these two extremes, right? We can't really be like Alyosha. We can't, hopefully we can't be like the father as well. But we can all sort of just understand how Dmitri gets to where he's at. I mean, he is sort of the most accessible of all the characters. And I think the fact that the action of the novel sort of revolves around him, with the murder and the false accusation, as well as all the drama with the two women, Grushenka and what is it, Katerina? There's just, I mean, it puts us. It's one of those on ramps into the novel. It gets us into the heart of things really well, by his character and the things that he says and does.
I think that's definitely a very important part to have, and I think Dmitri is one of those characters which you truly sympathize with. In some sense, he's struggling with a very big problem on his shoulders, and he doesn't really know what to do. And then when things seem to finally work out, he gets accused for a crime that he doesn't commit, and then gets sent to jail as a result of that. And I think in some sense, Dmitri is, I would say, the condition which is, or the person who's provided me with a lot of comfort. And the reason for that is, in some sense, it represents all of us. And he comes up with this absolutely brilliant line, which is something along the lines of, if I was in hell, I would still worship you, God. And that was a brilliant line. I think he was saying that when he was half drunk, but nevertheless, it was a very interesting presentation of Dmitri's viewpoint, and I think it's an insight which a lot of people kind of seem to lack. Is Dmitri seems to demonstrate how someone can do all the right things in his heart, but fundamentally fail due to human frailties and human weaknesses, which are perhaps no fault of his own, but at the same time, I guess, is a fault of his own in other senses. But nevertheless, that we are imperfect human beings, and that sin is a result of that imperfection, and sometimes the intention at the end of the day, and I think that's Dmitri's redeeming factor, is his heart is fundamentally in the right place a lot of the times, even though he can't really act it out in a proper way. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts about that, and perhaps what are some more thoughts about Dmitri?
I don't want to bring us to weird tangents, but it's also interesting to think about this in context of Crime and Punishment, because both men at the end get punished, and it seems like Dostoevsky sort of leaves us on more of a downer in this book, right? Dmitri's his position is not super hopeful in the end, whereas Raskolnikov, in the end of Crime and Punishment, things seem to work out for him. And I wonder if the trajectory or the end of Dmitri is something that we should take as sort of part of the message that Dostoevsky is trying to communicate.
Katrina, what are your thoughts on that comparison?
Yeah, I think it is like he's not like completely rotten, and considering he's of green and this like father situation, yeah, he has like a future, but yeah, like things started to work out, and then this like the church Yeah, I wonder if it's would be different.
Yes, definitely. I think that's an interesting contribution and thought right there. Perhaps we can now move on and talk about one of the main parts of the story, the Grand Inquisitor, of which a lot of people have written about and a lot of people have disagreed upon about what actually Dostoevsky is trying to do with it. Because in some sense, it is Ivan Karamazov's brilliant argument against Christ giving us freedom. But at the same time, freedom seems like a good thing to Dostoevsky, and in many senses, although Nikolai Berdyaev is considered the father of the father or philosopher of freedom, his conception of freedom fundamentally owes a lot of its roots to the importance of freedom given by Dostoevsky, and as a result, in some sense, well, perhaps to start off on the broader sense, what do you think is the argument behind the Grand Inquisitor? Firstly, from the perspective of Ivan Karamazov, and secondly, from the perspective of Dostoevsky himself. What's his goals by writing such a paradigmatic and confusing statement or question?
Well, if I could, let me just give maybe a bit more context to the Grand Inquisitor that might be helpful. Unless I'm incorrect, again, I listened to the book a bunch of times, but I haven't read the paper copy. So the orders sometimes get a little mixed up in my head, but I'm pretty sure right before the Grand Inquisitor is actually another very important sort of indictment on God, where Ivan goes and talks about all the terrible things that happened in basically recent Russian history. And you have, babies getting skewered by bayonets and dogs attacking kids and people freezing out in the cold. And this is all leading up to the Grand Inquisitor. So he's already softened his target quite a bit by explaining how messed up the world is. And he's particularly doing this in light of the suffering of children, because I think that's sort of maybe the most egregious, sort of suffering that we can experience. So when the Grand Inquisitor, myth or parable or whatever comes up, I think that's something that needs to be in our minds already before we even think about the content of the speech.
Yeah, because it is a complicated topic, because when the Grand Inquisitor puts Christ in prison and asks to relieve humanity from all of this, and he expects Christ to defend himself, to reply, to just expects a certain reaction. You know what I mean? And Christ just kisses him, blesses him, but at the same time, constantly thinking about all of this, all this misfortunes and all of this terrible stuff that happens to people overall, and I think it's kind of part of Ivan's internal conflict, and he kind of does expect the same.
Well, I mean, as we get to the actual the points made by the Grand Inquisitor, because it's sort of just like a diatribe. He's talking until Jesus kind of gets up and leaves. But the points that he's making are essentially that we're kind of taking care of it, right? Humanity is doing the thing. We don't need you because we're feeding people and we're teaching them and we're doing all this stuff, and things are sort of working out. I think the irony there is that it's especially in this time, but I think beyond that time, things aren't really working out very well for a vast swath of humanity, also indicated by the suffering talked about prior. But it also sort of touches upon, I think, the question of divine hiddenness, right? We don't actually get an answer from God. God doesn't defend himself, which is very similar to the book of Job, very similar to another book I really like, Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. I think the best portrayals of Christ and the best portrayals of God usually include him speaking very little and for a very skillful storyteller like Dostoevsky that just a small little something can really speak volumes.
Yes, I think that's a really fascinating thing, and you touch upon so many things that I think there's so. I mean, I would like to touch upon the problem of evil in a bit, and we can perhaps return to the idea of divine hiddenness and also kind of the context that you previously raised about it. The Grand Inquisitor being right after a rebellion where he talks about the problem of evil, but we perhaps and also Job as well. So we should perhaps return to that in a bit. However, before we do that, perhaps we could jump in a bit deeper into kind of the arguments that the Grand Inquisitor gives and Christ's response, because Ekaterina and Matt both have touched on different elements of that. On one hand, you have the Grand Inquisitor's arguments of that idea of freedom. In some sense, he is arguing against, well, Christ, why did you give humans so much freedom when you could have just saved everyone by just going along with what the devil had commanded him to do? And in some sense, this could, at face value, be seen as an argument against the Catholic Church, because essentially it's kind of like, oh, why the Catholic Church has done all these things to make sure that people would believe in God, but you didn't do that, and you gave humans free will instead, whereas the Catholic Church got rid of free will in return to in exchange for humans to just believe in God anyways. Now you could argue whether that's a good argument against the Church or not, and that's perhaps not in the scopes of this video. However, what I think is very interesting is that idea of that free will, and whether free will is worth all the suffering, perhaps in relation to the suffering presented in the previous chapter. Is all the suffering in the world worth the free will that we experience? And Christ's kiss is that importance of love. And it also seems to be almost in a sense that he, at least to me, somewhat agrees with the Grand Inquisitor by saying, yeah, actually, you know what, I have given humans so much freedom, and I have given humans the ability to inflict evil and suffering and hatred in the world, but that's kind of part of the experience, and that's part of the world that you have to live in. And I guess that ties into the theme of divine hiddenness, and perhaps we could almost go into our discussion on the problem of evil. But perhaps before I do so, do you think, perhaps this is a question to both Ekaterina and Matt, and do you think Dostoevsky agrees with the Grand Inquisitor in some sense? Do you think he disagrees with the Grand Inquisitor and agrees with Christ? And is it possible that both of the Grand Inquisitor's criticism of the burden of freedom being so heavy is almost unreasonably heavy burden for man is equally as true as God's love being strong enough to overcome that burden, even though it is so heavy and almost insurmountable for most human beings? Where do you think Dostoevsky stands in relationship to Ivan's argument? Matt, would you like to start us off?
I think one of the important things to remember is that, and this isn't necessarily explicitly said, but it's implicit in a lot of Dostoevsky and probably the Russians of that time, is that we can't be responsible for all evil, right? We can't bear the burden for all the evils that happen. And that's, I think, probably one of the problems with the internet. We're seeing this a lot as things are going down in Israel and in Ukraine. Like, everyone's evil is right in my doorstep. But what we do see is each individual in the story, and I think this applies to our lives in general, is they're responsible for their own lot of evil, whether that evil comes from external sources or whether it comes from their own decisions. And so I think one of the, we talk about existentialists, like one of the important points there is that, you kind of have to look at it through your own lens, and you can't suffer for everyone. You can only really experience your own suffering, and maybe sort of by extension the suffering of those who are right in your geographical location.
Katrina,
Really like your point. I just like Matt's points so much. Yeah, like you just be responsible only for your sum of suffering, and because like we're right now exposed to so much trauma. people before weren't even exposed to so much like information and news, right? Yeah, and if we're just going to be like responsible for our own like bubble of good and bad, it will eventually build up and make the world better, because like if people just going to start small from the area of control, which is sometimes very little.
You see it played out with Zosima, and you see it played out with Alyosha in this book. They are sort of living out that that idea of sort of doing what they can to just improve things by whatever increments they're able to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting point, and that idea of responsibility is a very complex one, because on one hand, it seems reasonable to demand from ourselves the idea that we have to be responsible for those around us, but at the same time, it's not good for our mental health and anything in relation to that. But at the same time, Zosima seems himself to be arguing that you should be responsible for everyone around you, and though of course you have to then contextualize that within Zosima's landscape of, as Ekaterina says, the people in the past knew probably a very smaller social circle than we do now. If something was going on in the opposite side of the road, perhaps they were in Russia, and something was going on in like South Africa, no one would know what's going on. But nowadays with TikTok or Instagram, people pull up their phone and they can know everything about what's happening everywhere in the world. And in some sense, the scope of the discussion has changed fundamentally. Now, perhaps developing upon this, and perhaps we should now turn to the problem of evil, precisely because I'm fully aware that the video is going on for quite a long time already, but I mean, I love this in-depth discussion. How do you think Zosima responds to the problem of evil, and do you think it's successful? Because there is a massive debate in the philosophy surrounding and the literature surrounding Dostoevsky about whether Zosima is actually, whether Zosima's contra to Ivan's pro in Rebellion or Mutiny is actually a successful response. What are your thoughts, and do you think Zosima successfully solves Ivan's problems?
Well, I'd have to really go back and look more in depth to answer that question with any amount of intelligence. But I think something I can say is that let me just think of, just give me 1 second. I'm just getting everything together in my head here.
I think he plants the seed, like the seed in Ivan's head that it's going to grow with the circumstances, especially now when he's charged.
Yes. That's interesting. Interesting notice you have there. It's a seed, and that seems to actually be the case if you look at, I think, his letter to his editor when he submitted, because of course the Brothers Karamazov was published in a serialized fashion. He wrote initially saying, okay, the next chapter, the next chapter after Pro and Contra, you would have the response, but then after that he seems to disagree with himself and say, well, actually, no, the entire book is meant to be a response to the problem of evil. So it's not just Zosima's response, but the entire life of the book of the Brothers Karamazov is a response to the problem of evil. And that raises a whole other nuance to it. And it ties perfectly and beautifully back to what Ekaterina said at the very start of our discussion today, when she said, perhaps Alyosha is that kind of fundamental response, that living, that embodiment of goodness or of the Christian faith, which responds and makes the world a better place, and perhaps that conception and that idea is fundamentally the heart of it, and it's that seed which grows into a development of a good life, which then allows us to respond to evil in an active way instead of a passive one. Instead of trying to solve it with theodicies or whatever abstract reasoning, the only response to evil is to accept it, to accept the divine hiddenness of God, as Matt says, and move beyond it into active life and active adoration of God. Now, perhaps developing upon that, do you have anything you want to say about theodicy and about the response, or should we talk a bit about kind of Ivan's kind of argument in his presentation of the problem of evil, and perhaps try to answer the biggest question: was Ivan an atheist in traditional sense? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just you having said what you said kind of jogged what I was planning on saying, and I might not even be useful saying after you've said what you said. But I think one of the studies that I like to one of the philosophical studies that I really go into a lot is Plato. And something that I learned from Plato that I think is really sort of helpful for this is that you sort of need, in order to understand a lot of his philosophies, you need the whole thing. Like, you need to read a lot of books, a lot of his individual works to make sense of ideas like the forms or other sort of ideas that span. He doesn't go into like a lot of depth in any one particular book, but once you kind of get the broad scope of things, you can understand it sort of more viscerally. Like, you kind of understand it by experiencing it. That's one of the benefits of the format of dialogue. And I think that's the way that Dostoevsky goes about it. I think you're right. There's not a seriously constructed theodicy or anything that would be considered syllogistic. But we look at how the lives of the individuals played out, how they ended, the cumulative happiness of the folks that are in the story, and the way that we feel about what's happening. I think I've seen people approach this book and be very concerned. People feel like, evil won. Ivan was right, but I think those people started with maybe a less than favorable outlook to start with. But I think most people get the sense that there's something off with what Ivan is saying, even if I can't put my finger on it exactly.
No, precisely. I think that's a very interesting point, and I think tying upon that, I guess we should ask a question of whether Ivan was actually an atheist, because, of course, the standard reading is, Ivan's atheist, Alyosha's a theist, and, well, one believes in God, the other one doesn't believe in God, or doesn't believe that God exists. Now, well, but is that reading too simple? Because I guess you could say, well, actually, perhaps Ivan was not really an atheist at his heart, that he believed that God exists, and this ties back to our previous discussion about the internal contradiction within his ideas, and that goes to his beautiful phrase saying, well, it's not exactly God that I reject, it's just his ticket I return to him. So perhaps with that in mind, I guess, what are your thoughts? And I guess right now I'm meaning atheists in the purely metaphysical sense of, is there a God or not? Does Ivan need to believe that God exists or doesn't exist to hold his position? Or could Ivan very much believe that God exists but nevertheless still hold his position?
One of my favorite, something that really stands out to me from this book is something kind of maybe a little less grand than the Grand Inquisitor. It's this little parable tucked into when Ivan is talking to the devil in his fever fit, and the parable is about the man who dies, and God says you have to walk like, I don't know, 1 billion miles or something like that, and throughout through some kind of metaphysical paradox, this guy does it, and he gets into heaven, and he realizes it was all worth it. And that was something that Ivan thought up prior. It was something that he had thought up in his youth. And I think it's a sort of really helpful touchstone as we think about who he is and what he's doing. I think he believes. I don't know to what effect he believes, and perhaps the questions, the issues that he brings up are just so strangling his ability to believe that it doesn't really matter. But I think ultimately, the idea that things will work out in the end is something that's present in his beliefs, in his thoughts.
Yes, Ekaterina, anything to add to that?
No, I just completely agree about this. Yeah, this dream that he had, it kind of does shows another side of him, and yeah, this idea that it will work out, it's beautiful.
Yeah, and also it's while he's at his weakest too. I mean, he's not putting up any pretensions of of trying to make an intellectual flourish, talking to his brother. It's just kind of really raw, and it's just something that was clearly in the center of his the belief system.
Yes, and I think that's a very beautiful part of philosophy and Ivan's kind of presentation is the times in which he is most fervent in his presentation are precisely the times in which he seems to be the least intellectual. He seems to be speaking from the heart, and that's something which is very important. And furthermore, I think there is a very interesting point here in which I think we touched upon it previously a bit as well at the very start, is the idea of Ivan is fundamentally living in a contradiction. On one hand, he's saying, okay, I'm going to object and reject the existence of God, or at least, no, let me rephrase this, because I think that we've established there's a very significant difference between belief in God and belief that God exists. He wants to reject very much the need to worship God because he sees how much evil there is in the world, and from purely a moral basis he rejects that God, even if it was the case that God allowed, even if it was the case that the evil in the world would lead to greater good, because he rejects the traditional theodicies. Now, developing upon that notion, one can then say, well, actually, he's kind of arguing against God, which is necessary for morals, assuming that he does believe that without the immorality of the soul, then all things are permissible. Then he is accepting that God exists and the need for God, yet cannot possibly accept God. And hence, it leaves him in a position where he fundamentally needs to believe in something. And I think it leaves us in almost Ivan. It leaves Ivan in the drama, or the wake of what Henri de Lubac called the drama of atheist humanism, which is just essentially the idea of, well, what is man trying to do without God as a metaphysical entity, but nevertheless humans need something to believe in, and essentially everyone after Hegel and Kant have been trying to solve that problem, and it seems to fundamentally lead nowhere, both from Nietzsche to Feuerbach to a lot of other thinkers. You get this situation where Ivan tries to live a life where he can say, I don't need to believe in any higher order than man, but nevertheless, the higher order of man is there and is staring him in the face, and that he cannot accept the fact that there is no higher order in man. And I think that is fundamentally kind of the struggle and dilemma which Ivan Karamazov faces all the time. And I think that perfectly kind of rests upon the idea of, well, was he an atheist or was he not an atheist? Well, perhaps it could be either, or it could be a very complex mixture of all of the above, perhaps in different senses, or depending on how you phrase it. Perhaps before we end off this video and this discussion, it's been a great privilege to talk about the brothers Karamazov with Ekaterina and Matt. Do you have any closing thoughts on the brothers Karamazov and how it impacted your life and what you took away from it? Ekaterina, do you want to start?
I think it's really tied to Ivan, and because he needs something to believe in, and and even from personal experience, when there is like a lot of doubt and you just don't have a clear picture of the world, let's just say. You don't have like a clear picture, and you doubt everything around you, and you don't understand what to believe it or not. It does create a lot of problems and issues, and how to say it? Yeah, because Alyosha is so much like, it's like the healthiest of the healthiest in this book, because he has like a strong value base that it's like, and the mentorship and it's like it's there, it's a foundation, and that he like interacts with the world through this like belief foundation system. And Ivan is in so much conflict because he doesn't get the foundation that he works from. And this is why it's very important to have a belief foundation. Like, you know, the sky is blue, this one is that, this one is that.
Yes, definitely. Matt, do you have any takeaways or kind of feelings which has stemmed from reading this book?
Yeah, it's one of, I think it's my favorite book. I think it's that, and probably Plato's Republic is number 2. And the interesting thing about both of those books is that I am a Christian. I believe what Alyosha believes. I believe what Zosima believes. And one of recently, probably within the last year or so, I've had what you'd consider a trial of faith. I've had doubts, and this book has been one of those things that's actually kept me grounded. It was one of the things that has kept my faith in existence strong, because I think one of the points he's making is that you don't have to have all the answers to all the questions. But when you get your feet on the ground and when you experience life in light of certain truths about who God is and who I am and what my job is, and when you actually start getting your hands dirty and doing it like Alyosha did, some of those answers don't really matter. And some of them you'll get later on, but some of them you'll never get. And so I think his perspective is correct. I think that he's responding to, this really unsavory form of modernism, that stems from Descartes and kind of has never gone away since, that the only thing that I can accept is something that's rationally or empirically verifiable, and that I can, sort of work from this ground up foundation of what is true. And I think that we can easily get into that desire to do that. But what this book does really well is it teaches us that, number one, we won't be able to do that and have any form of sanity left. And number two, the most important answers are the ones that can't be formulated logically, and we have to sort of take comfort in those answers. So that's what the book means to me.
Yes, I think that's thank you for sharing that. I think it's a very beautiful idea that is, in some sense, Dostoevsky's, well, in theory, not last, because it was his last work, but then he did intend for it to go longer. But nevertheless, it is a summary of a lot of his mature thoughts and the summary of a lot of his previous work. So in some sense, if you're looking for that analysis or that kind of that understanding of, well, what is Dostoevsky like, what are his thoughts and his ideas, well, I would say The Brothers Karamazov is a must-read book for that. And I hope you've enjoyed this video, this discussion on The Brothers Karamazov. It was a great experience to talk about these different characters with you, hear some of Dostoevsky's ideas. The beautiful thing about all such literary works is that they're very much open to interpretation. You might listen to what we've said and say, well, actually, I don't agree with this stuff. And if that's the case, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. I mean, I keep my eyes out of the comments, and I'll happily talk to you about that there. And of course, if you want to learn more about philosophy, theology, and Slavic mythology, or all those interesting things and literature, then make sure you go check out our channels, Ekaterina's channel, Matt's channel, my channel. There's some really valuable information there as well. Thank you for watching, stay safe, and goodbye.